Welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next. I'm here with Rabbi Ken Spiro. Um, Rabbi Spiro, we're going to talk today about Christianity, some of the history of Christianity and its relationship with Judaism. But, I was just going through a bunch of questions from a mother-daughter leadership program that I run. And one of the questions that I was just looking at was, if Jesus was Jewish, then how did Christianity come from Jesus? So it seems like maybe this is right in line with what we were going to talk about today. So if we're going to talk about Christianity, and as you mentioned when we were speaking earlier, it's right after Christmas. Where do we even begin with the topic of Christianity? And I'm just going to give the audience a caveat. This may end up being a part one, but let's see. Where should we start?
Again, another small topic to touch on.
Right.
So, so you have to realize that there's a fundamental difference, Ellie, between Christianity and Judaism, and that Judaism is both a faith, it's called a religion, and it's a national identity, whereas Christianity is a purely religious identity, which of course will impact very much why Christianity spreads, why Judaism doesn't, how the Christian world looks at itself versus the Jewish world. It has a lot of implications, but Judaism is the faith of the Jewish people. But even if you're not an observant Jew, you're still part of the Jewish people. And even if you're a religious observant Jew living outside the land of Israel, also you're still part of the Jewish people. So, but the more interesting question is the origins of Christianity. Unlike the Jewish people, we could follow the evolution of Judaism from the biblical narrative of it starts out as a family faith, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 12 sons, the tribes, the whole story's there in the Bible. Um, and you should know, by the way, that even genetically, we Jews, although we have been living spread around the world for thousands of years, and we look very different from each other. Those of us from Eastern Europe might look very different from our cousins from North Africa. But even on a genetic level, there's kind of a Jewish genetic signature. I mean, we have this different, if you do ancestry.com or 23andMe, you'll see that, it clearly distinguishes between, like, my family came out, both my parents 100% Ashkenazi, not even 99.9%. I was hoping for something exotic, but the 100% gefilte fish eaters. And but and
Amazing.
but if we do if you look at the genetic makeup of someone from North Africa, the Middle East, the Levant,
Mm,
there's things we have differently that has to do with the whole fascinating history, a lot of which we've talked about, of us intermingling with other people and so many people joining us. But the core of
mhm.
who we are is one people and one geographic piece of real estate. So that's a unique understanding of who we are. But Christianity, Judaism will give birth, so to speak, figuratively, to two offshoot faiths whose origins begin in the book of Genesis with its Jewish tradition talks about, we're not going to go into this now, but that, Jacob's twin brother Esav, Jewish tradition says that he will become Edom and Edom becomes Rome and Rome becomes Western civilization. And also Christianity is a faith, the Roman Catholic Church. And the progenitor that comes before that is Isaac, Yitzchak's half brother, Yishmael, who's from Abraham's second wife, Hagar, the Egyptian princess. And even Islamic tradition agrees. It's one of the few things we really agree with them on, that they're a brother from another mother. That out of Ishmael's descendants will become Arabs, and out of Arabs will become a faith called Islam, which we have talked about before. And even though today Islam began as a religion of nomadic Arabic-speaking people of the Arabian Peninsula 1,300 years ago, today only 30% of Muslims are actually Arab. So it's not. So Islam is also a religious identity. But both of these actually are connected to us, even on a biological level, according to the narrative within the Bible in the book of Genesis. But to go to a more historical, I'm not saying that these stories are not historical, but to go to a more contemporary, it's not even contemporary, actually, it's quite old, but easily verifiable historical, because the book, Genesis exists in a historical vacuum. There's no other, we can't go to the library of ancient books and find people talking about ancient patriarch Abraham and Jacob and Ishmael and Isaac. But the origins of both these faiths both appear at historical periods of time. The origins of Christianity actually begins in really what is late Second Temple period. When I say late Second Temple period, I'm talking about the Second Temple is destroyed in the year 70. So it's late Second Temple period Judea, which means The land of Israel is occupied by the Roman Empire that appeared on the scene in the year 63 BCE when Pompey Magnus will conquer the land of Israel from the Maccabean rulers and absorb it into the Roman Empire. And the Roman occupation will continue for hundreds of years after, but the big cataclysmic event will be in the year 70 CE with the destruction of the Second Temple also by the Romans. And it's during this very tumultuous and difficult period of time in Jewish history because we have a very difficult relationship with the Roman Empire. Jews have had a very difficult relationship with everyone since our inception. Remember that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus? That's the Jewish relationship with the world for literally thousands of years. I mean, from the birth
It
of
was also
Abraham
like,
to, yeah.
yeah, it was like built into our name, when they called Ivri, right? That we're other. We're always going to be somehow other. And that's the root of anti-Semitism, right? We're always going to be othered to whatever is the worst of society's evils. They are going to make the Jews or Israel that. But it also is what makes us out of the box and other and able to do what we can do. So it's not surprising. Okay, wait. I'm gonna wait. Hold my questions. Keep going.
Okay, so just think a little further, then you can ask some more questions there. So you're right that the Ivri is very true. When I say other, the Ivri, Abraham, he's on one side of the river, which is not a literal river. It's a figurative, theoretical, ideological, spiritual river that we are the only monotheists in the world for literally millennia, and that makes us extremely different from anyone else, and very much standing apart from everyone else in our insistence on the exclusive worship of one God, which made us seem very arrogant and aloof to the ancient world. And you can see, by the way, with the period of time that corresponds to the birth of Christianity, there are already Greek Roman writers of the Mediterranean who are writing about the Jewish people and talking precisely about how weird Jews are in the world. But the backdrop to the creation of Christianity is that late Second Temple period. Now we know the whole Second Temple period, to back up a little earlier, is not like the First Temple period. Yes, we have a Jewish state, but unlike the First Temple period, the majority of Jews are living outside the land of Israel. The largest diaspora community, which was established with the destruction of the First Temple, is going to be Babylon, which is today Iraq. And that will remain the center of the Jewish world even after Israel and Jerusalem fade in terms of Jewish population and Jewish control of the land. Um, so that's one big difference. Number two is, yes, there's a temple, but the priesthood is corrupted. There are a few kings like Herod and his descendants, but they're not legitimate. They are appointed by the Romans, and they don't come from the Davidic bloodline. Herod himself, who ruled from 37 to 4 BCE, is half Edomite and half Nabatean. So you have Jews scattered around the world. The one thing that keeps the Jewish people together at this time is basically the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court system, but it's under attack. And Judaism is and also prophecy has ceased. So central authority is greatly weakened. There's no one central political leader or monarch who's accepted by everyone. And there's no way of speaking directly to God to get in clarity and information. And what's holding the Jewish people together will be the rabbis, who will assume an inordinate amount of power in the Jewish governmental system, which was supposed to be priesthood, kingship, and the Torah rabbinic authority. And then those people acted as like the Congress, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. So those are differences. But because of that, and this is really leading up to what the birth of Christianity is going to be, external and external tension. Externally, it's going to be the tension of living amongst the Romans and the pagan inhabitants of the land of Israel, who are always bumping up against. And there's a lot of animus towards Jews. And the fact that we're not assimilating and not drinking their wine and not eating their meat and not marrying their women and not worshiping their gods and that kind of stuff. That's kind of a spiritual difference. There's also a nationalist difference, that the Romans are occupiers. And, you just as today you have in the land of Israel, you have the religious Zionist movement and I don't like to use the word, but the settlers, so to speak. These are people who are very much into the, land of Israel for the Jewish people, for the people of Israel, who feel it's an outrage that the uncircumcised pagan Romans are dominating the land of Israel. So this is a factor that's going to cause a lot of external tension with the people who dominate us. And Rome is an incredible world power at the time. They dominate the whole Mediterranean. And internally, lack of central authority and foreign influence, which begins with the Greeks, which starts to corrupt Jewish thinking and create splinter sects. Way before the birth of Christianity, we have the creation of offshoot heretical sects that are breaking away from mainstream Judaism. The origins, the ones that the listeners are probably most familiar with, are the Sadducees, the Tzaddukim, who were originally
Mm.
probably the students of an apostate student of the head of the Sanhedrin going back a long time ago to the second century BCE called Yeshua ben Prachia. Some of his students were probably influenced by Greek thinking, and it made them go off the derech, as we say. So you have breakaway groups, and Judaism acknowledges these, talks about them all the time. They're mentioned in the Mishnah. And like, for instance, the Tzaddukim will infest the priesthood. And you see the Mishnah, which is the codification of the oral law put together about 1800 years ago by Yehuda HaNasi, reflects that when it talks about the temple, how the Tzadduki priests who did not hold by mainstream Jewish authority would do divergent things in the temple, which would cause a lot of anger and backlash from the people. So that's kind of the background. Internal tension, schism is the word we want to really focus on now. Breakaway groups, external tension. The last thing to throw into that picture would be, because of the difficult, tumultuous situation, and because messianic expectation, which is a Jewish concept, the notion of a personality showing up as kind of the catalyst to prepare the Jewish people in the world to enter that redemptive period of time, is always running as a background program in the collective consciousness of the Jewish people. We see that messianic expectation is an inverse relationship with the situation of the Jewish world or the Jews in the land of Israel. It's like kind of sine and cosine, meaning when things are really bad in the Jewish world, like we can see this throughout history, like 2,000 years ago, Roman occupation, exactly the period of time I'm talking about now, there's always going to be a upsurge in expectation of the Messiah because things are really, really bad. He's got to come, which is going to only feed schism, religious fervor, fanaticism, false messianism, and all this stuff. And all this kind of throws into this giant pot, which is going to be the cauldron out of which Christianity is going to emerge as basically,
Can you just define schism? Just what you mean when you say that?
it's just breakaway ideologies.
Got
Like
it.
when something schism, it cracks into parts, it breaks away. In the
Got it.
first temple period, there are no, today we have, look at the Jewish world, we have Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, we have different versions of Orthodox. We have tree hugging animist Jews and Boo Jews and Reconstructionist Jews and all of these things we have going back, 1,000 years plus, Karaites. We have all of these. None of this exists in the first temple period because when you have unified government. Everyone is basically Torah observant. You have a king who's the political leader of the entire Jewish people, a court system that oversees all decisions made for the entirety of Jewish people, which we have not had for nearly 2,000 years. And you have prophecy, and you have the creator of the universe can communicate directly and say, no, that's wrong. No one's going to break away and argue. No one's going to argue that the Torah is not from Mount Sinai, that the oral law is made up by rabbis, which is another topic we don't want to get into now, but that's going to be the creation of many of the splinter sects is going to be because the rabbis will assume inordinate authority. And the job of the rabbis has been literally from the Second Temple period onward, first and foremost, the transmission of the oral law, without which you cannot have Judaism. You can't live as a Jew without the Torah, without the oral law. I don't mean the five books of Moses. The practical application of how we live as Jews individually and collectively comes from that oral law. The adaptation of it based on changing technology and political circumstances, and the interpretation of it is the authority of the rabbis. So since it's based on that oral law, schism, the splinter sects that have broke away, they've always, whether it's the Tzaddukim, whether it's the Karaites, whether it's modern movements in Judaism, have always attacked.
So are you suggesting then that Christianity is a type of schism
Well,
from the
we
original
got to
track
work
of
our way into
Judaism?
that one. We got to work our way into that one. But they would attack its legitimacy. It isn't. It didn't come directly out of that. But that's some kind of, I'm just painting with the broadest brushstrokes, kind of the big picture.
Got it.
Because like just as Jewish history doesn't happen in a vacuum, Christianity doesn't emerge out of a nothing. It emerged out of a
Mm.
whole theological, national, political experience of what's going on in the Middle East at the time. And there's a number of, we see the problem is we know something about these splinter sects. It's interesting that one of the most interesting places that we learn about this is Qumran. Qumran is a site. It's an archaeological site. If you go down to the Jericho Road from Jerusalem and you make a right turn going south on Route 90, when you hit the Dead Sea, you drive a couple miles off to the right. It says Qumran, and Qumran is a site that was really discovered really pretty much on the eve of Israel's independence. A Bedouin shepherd by the name of Muhammad al-Dib was throwing rocks into a cave, just bored, watching his goats. There's caves on the sides of the mountain. And he hears something smash, and he climbs in the cave, and he finds these ancient, giant jugs, which have scrolls in them. Now, scrolls don't usually survive thousands of years, but because it's the Dead Sea, because they're in a cave, because it's extremely dry and low humidity, it's called, this is what we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are thousands of fragments. Many, but not all, were found in Qumran. Some ended up in Israel. Some ended up with the Jordanians, who ended up occupying East Jerusalem. It's a whole big story, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself. Israel ended up with a huge chunk of them in the end. And they're basically divided like a third, a third, a third into three things. The oldest existent versions of the Hebrew, we have parts of every single book of the Hebrew Bible, sadly not the entire Bible. These date back 2,200 years. It would be great to be able to compare the text we have today since up until the birth of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century, everything was copied by hand, and scribal errors get into all documents. It'd be great to compare the texts. By the way, from what we do
Do
have
we,
surviving, we have every single book but Esther. We have the entire book of Isaiah.
right?
But it's remarkably close, by the way. What we do have is remarkably close. We just don't have all the texts. A third of the writings are what we would call apocrypha, pseudo-apocrypha, like the book of Ben Sira, the book of Jubilees. These are books written by authors who are writing about spirituality at this period of time in the mid-Second Temple period that are not canonized. They didn't go through the canonical process of being included within the Hebrew Bible, which was already sealed, so to speak, by the men of the Great Assembly in Babylon prior to the Second Temple period. What we know is the Hebrew Bible of 24 books, Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the five books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings, was basically canonized, made holy by rabbis in Babylon before the beginning of the Second Temple period. So these books, the Christian Bible Catholic Bible contains quite a few of them. So that's some of the writings. But they're very insightful because it shows us a lot of what was going on theologically in people's brains. The third is the rules and regulations and writings of whatever sect possibly may have. There's a lot of what ifs, possible conjecture when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It could have been that people were fleeing to there and brought their writings with them, and they're all stored in the scriptorium in these rooms, in these caves. It could be that people who wrote them didn't even live there. But we like to call these people Essenes, which is the Dead Sea sect, who could have been Essenes. Essenes are talked about by Josephus, the great first century Jewish historian who lived between the year 40 of the Common Era and 100, who gave us the famous story of the Jewish revolt against Rome and the Masada suicide story. But what's interesting is this is where, and if you go to Qumran today, Ellie, it's very interesting. They have a movie there. I'm a tour guide. I almost never go there with groups. But who goes there? Every Christian group that comes to Israel goes to Qumran. First of all, the movie that they made, they always make these reenactment movies. And it's clearly really geared for Christian audiences. It even talks about, I haven't seen the movie in years, but John the Baptist just passed through here. Because these were groups, I mean, again, we're speculating. With the broadest brushstrokes, as I always like to say, it seems that one or more different sects had kind of fled Jerusalem and moved down to this very isolated place in the desert. The desert, we know, is a place of purity. Like they used to have a bumper sticker in Qumran. It had two mosquitoes on it. It says there's nightlife in Qumran. There's not a lot of temptation and distraction in these places. And they were religious Jews. I don't like to use the word Orthodox, but they were Torah observant Jews who had a slightly divergent version of Judaism based on that third of the text that seems to talk about the rules of their community. And they're very apocalyptic, meaning focusing on the end of days kind of scenarios that Judaism introduced to the world, that Christianity and Islam later picked up with the book of Revelations in the Christian Bible, etc. But they seem to have, it seems to be, again, huge topic, but it seems to be that their view was that Jerusalem was corrupted, the priesthood was corrupted, which, by the way, seems to be the case. The end is near. The evil Roman, the evil dark empire of Rome, because there's always this, the Gog and Magog narrative that's in the book of Ezekiel and Zechariah, which is the nations of the world come against Jerusalem. And it seems at that time, it seemed that was like going on. The Roman Empire, which was the world. No one knew anything but the Roman Empire is coming against Jerusalem. So we're going to go to a place of purity and a place of safety to await the end. And they talk about a leader they called the teacher of the righteous. And from what we could tell about them, they're basically religious Jews. They keep kosher, they kept Shabbat, but they were extreme to say the least. They may have been celibate, meaning they weren't marrying, which is not something Judaism has. Although in the cemetery near Qumran, we do find the remains of women buried there, so it's a debate. They may have practiced extreme ritual purity, which meant that they put the bathroom in 2,000 amma, which is a biblical distance outside the camp. And because you can't walk that distance on Shabbat, that means they didn't go to the bathroom for 25 hours.
Is it possible that they were practicing like as a Nazir? And is that related to the term Nazarite in some way? Or
Well, yeah,
Nazareth?
Nazarite. Well, no, that's not Scott. Jesus of Nazareth. Don't confuse Jesus with the Jesus thing we haven't even gotten into. And I have a feeling this is going to be a two-part class already.
Yep.
But yeah. But a Nazir in Judaism is a concept of a person who goes through certain areas of abstaining from not physical relations with a woman, but from cutting their hair, shaving, or consuming anything made of grapes like wine. It's something, and it's not a permanent state one is in, except for people like Samson and Samuel, who seem to have chosen that path from birth. And they're very unusual. It's something you did for basically like a month. And you cut your hair off, you shave, whatever. It's a form of penance, like behavioral modification, the B.F. Skinner kind of approach to changing your behavior when you're affected by something negatively.
Right.
Um, so it doesn't seem that they were, by the way, monasticism, the whole idea of abstinence,
Mm.
celibacy, it probably, and also if you look at some of the earliest monasteries, you go to Greece, you see these things outside of the hills. They're really cool monasteries, and the Buddhists have their monasteries.
Right.
There's an idea in Eastern spirituality, especially of abstinence from the physical world,
Right.
is a way of as a higher level of spirituality. By the way, Judaism only views that as a kind of behavioral modification measure you would take to get yourself in line, as Maimonides would talk about. If you're extremely stingy, it's like a metal bar. Bend it the
Right.
other way, become overly generous, then you release the bar and it's in the middle somewhere. It's not a Jewish concept, by the way. Judaism is about engaging with, not elevating, not just dumping the
Right.
physical
We're not
world.
we're
So it's
not
not
ascetics. We don't believe that you can just disappear into a cave in the mountain
right,
and that
right.
that's
I mean, there have
really
been
the way
people
to
like
go.
exactly. There have been people like Rabbi Isaac Luria, the great, 500 years ago, Kabbalistic thinker who went through periods of time when he would isolate himself. Like, he grew up in Egypt by the Nile for weeks and weeks and weeks and just meditate and study. So some people do that. That works for them. But the whole monastic tradition, which begins in Christianity, which views that as the highest thing, and we're getting ahead of ourselves. We haven't even gotten to the birth of Christianity yet. But the whole monastic tradition um, could well be arising from this kind of thing you see in Qumran of a group of men who are dedicated to spirituality. And what are they doing? There's a room in there. If you view the archaeology, it's only like the remains of buildings. They have this room called the scriptorium, from the word for Latin for writing, which is the place where these guys would copy manuscripts, because everything in the ancient world was copied by hand. When you get up to medieval
Wow.
Europe, just about the only literate people were monks, and they used to have in monasteries these beautiful illuminated manuscripts. And they were, ironically, I always said the great irony of the Catholic Church was that the only people who were literate didn't bother to reproduce, at least not legally. So, so
Right.
much for
Wow.
passing on the better educated people didn't seem to pass on their genes to anyone else.
Mm.
But this Dead Sea sect, or these group of people, it could have been maybe one group of people or multiple people,
Mm.
where it seemed to have isolated themselves and were practicing sort of Judaism on steroids in a certain way, divergent, definitely separated themselves from mainstream Judaism, definitely were not following Pharisaic Judaism. When I say Pharisaic, those familiar with the New Testament, I always say, and it's not to be harsh to any of our Christian listeners, but pretty much anyone in the New Testament says is with the exception of Pontius Pilate. Bad from our perspective is good, and vice versa. Like the Samaritans were not good; they were really bad. but the Pharisees is the name we give those rabbis who assumed that inordinate central role in the Jewish people. It comes from the word perushim. They were the ones who separated themselves out from the external influences that were invading the Jewish world spiritually and causing people to go in the wrong way. And
Mm,
they were like the hardcore spiritual legal warriors for the transmission and preservation of the Jewish people. They are the spiritual great grandparents of the rabbis of today and of Orthodox. The term Orthodox, again, I don't like it because
mm,
it was a term created by the Reform to make religious Jews look ossified and static, but Torah
right.
observant Judaism. You can kind of, Ellie, look at it as a tree branch, a tree trunk, and that I put like TO in it, Torah observance. And that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai and then offshoots that at different periods of time have been impacted in the case of this period of time we're talking about by the influences of Greco-Roman culture and political influences and the lack of central authority. And later on, there'll be influences of Jews interacting with enlightened European culture, which will cause the creation of the reform movement in Germany. It's all nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon says. So that's kind of the background. So,
Okay. So
yeah.
that gives us kind of the environment within which Christianity seems to have started to form, where Judaism really felt like it was on the brink of destruction. And there was this more extreme sect that sort of separated itself out. So, how did that lead to some Jewish guy starting to preach Jewish ideas to a lot of non-Jews? And why did people buy in?
Right. So then we get to that's really the next question. So we know there are splinter groups, and we know that what we'd call this is the real interesting part that people don't get. I call it Judeo Christianity. Now, Judeo Christianity are not Messianic Jews, like Jews
Mm,
who believe in Jesus of today. That's a different thing completely.
hmm
Judeo Christians were proto Christians insofar as they were Orthodox Jews. The closest thing I could think of would be one of these the Essene sect in the ancient world, who are basically people who are religious Jews, who are messianic in not that there's God has a son and that stuff we'll talk about later, but rather that we are approaching the end of days and this Messiah concept, which is, in a nutshell, the 2-second overview is, the Messiah is a person from the Davidic bloodline who has the spiritual connection, the leadership skills, and the Torah knowledge to unify the Jewish people, bring the Jewish people physically back to the land of Israel, spiritually back to observance, unify us all behind him. You fight off all the enemies who try and destroy us. And now this is already before the destruction of the temple, but in after post-destruction, rebuilding the temple, reestablishing Jewish government, kingship, temple service, the priests serving in the temple, animal sacrifice, the Sanhedrin, and elevating the Jewish people and the whole world back to God. So that concept, as I said, is always in Jewish consciousness, and
Was
this Essene
was
sect,
that
yeah.
was that concept anywhere else in the ancient world, or is that a uniquely monotheistic Jewish idea? Like, did other cultures, like Zoroastrianism or whatever it was that was out there, did they also have this idea of a Messiah? It seems particular to like Judeo-Christian monotheistic faiths. Am I wrong on
Well,
that?
Zoroastrianism has this, I mean, the dualistic worldview. Zoroastrianism is a religion of ancient Persia that's dated back to the first century before the Common Era. People like to claim it's the first monotheistic faith, that Judaism grew out of it. I do not agree with that at all. It's dualistic, first of all. You have Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and you have Ahiram, darkness, and there's this struggle so that there's showdown between good and evil is not unique to Judaism, but the notion of an individual coming along as a redeemer, again, I can't say I know enough about Zoroastrianism to know where they have a similar concept, but the concept that exists within Islam, which is the Mahdi, and within Christianity, which is called Christ, which when the Messiah kind of idea, that Christos, which is the Greek word for anointing, which comes out of the idea of Moshiach, which is the root of the word Messiah, comes from Judaism itself. So, but you see, with what I said already, with the notion of of this messianic concept running as a background program in the collective consciousness of the Jewish people and all the turmoil that's going on in the splinter sect existing will come out of this groups like the Essenes who will be following a spiritual leader who they view as a Messiah, a la the Jewish concept of Messiah, meaning this is the guy who has the Torah knowledge, and whether he could prove his bona fides as a direct descendant of King David, I have no idea whether the teacher of the righteous could do that or not, but they put their money on him as being the guy who was going to bring the redemptive process into place. So whereas but that really brings us into the really interesting discussion about historicity of the whole Jesus character. And we have to also focus on the fact that there's no one running around the Middle East thousands of years ago who's named Jesus. There's no one named James. There's no one named Mary. There's no one named Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These are English versions of Latin versions of Greek versions of Hebrew names. Now, they may have been Miriam, Yoshua, Jonathan, and Yaakov, and Yosef, and we don't know what else, but we don't know that. We don't know that. So that's important to understand that that's just not the reality of what's going on. But the different sources, like what do we know about Jesus? So first of all, the Jesus narrative comes from the gospel. I mean, the Christian Bible has different parts to it. It's a much smaller book than the Hebrew Bible, but you have 4 books that are called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is another huge discussion. John is a very different writing style. But the earliest gospel narrative is considered to be Mark, and he's dated to around the year 60, which is right around the time of Paul, who we have to talk about later. I know they're going to get to Paul today. But there's Matthew and Luke are all Mark is considered to be the earliest narrative, and Matthew and Luke come after, and they're based on Mark. So it's called the synoptic gospel, from the Greek word synoptic, one eye, meaning it's one original author that the later 2 authors are based on, Mark being first and Matthew and Luke coming after. So it's basically you writing a story that I copy and write more about it. The problem is according to the academic opinion and the historians and the scholars, the gospel authors are not contemporaneous with the character of what we call Jesus, whatever his name was. A lot of people like to call him like, Yeshua. The Jews for Jesus love to do that because Jesus is a scary word for Jews. And it also doesn't sound very Jewish. You call him Joshua, he sounds more user-friendly. So the dates for the Jesus character is the year 1. There's no year 0. The calendar we use today, 2025, we're now in as of a few weeks ago, is based on the birth of Jesus. The fact that the whole world uses that calendar, which in the Christian world they call AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. The rest of the world calls CE, Common Era, because the whole world holds it as the common starting point, even for people who aren't believers in Christianity or Jesus. But that personality is dated to the year 1 to the year 32 of the Common Era. And if you look at the earliest gospel narrative being Mark and appearing around the year 60, that's like 3 decades after Jesus is dead already, according to the gospel narrative. And the gospel narrative is important because that's what gives us. Now, by the way, there are other gospels that have been found in Nag Hammadi in the earlier 20th century in Egypt, the gospel of Judas Iscariot, the gospel of Mary Magdalene. These could be texts that are actually, they're not actually written by those people. It's called apocrypha or pseudo-apocrypha. Like there's the book of Enoch, which is a book that Enoch is a character that appears, the descendants of Noah and the different people and the different early generations. It's written in the Second Temple period. It's not written by the guy named Enoch, but it's pseudo-apocrypha, meaning they're borrowing, some later writer is borrowing the name. Like I write the book of George Washington in the year 2025. So there's these books that are named after people who appear in the gospel narrative, but they're not actually authored by those characters. These books are either suppressed, deliberately suppressed, are not included in the Christian Bible, which is in and of itself canonized. It's made holy. What is it included? Just as there are books that were not included in the Hebrew Bible because the men of the Great Assembly decided that either they didn't meet the criteria of being written by a prophet and having a message that was relevant throughout all of history. The early formers, the early church fathers who create what's called the Christian Bible, the New Testament of today, had a very specific worldview and chose texts that that taught that worldview. It's a really interesting subject. So we have gospel. Anyone interested in this can read someone. I know some of the Christian listeners who are really well educated are going to frown, but read Dr. Elaine Pagels, her book called The Gnostic Gospel, which begins with a G that's silent. Gnostic, the Gnostic Gospel. And she talks about these divergent texts that are not included. So, but bottom line, what you're asking is the character of Jesus, who is the basis of what we call Christianity of today, um, is not is not written about by contemporaneous people who are the apostles of Jesus, the guys who run around, the fishermen up in the Galilee, and the one female, Mary. There's two Marys. One is his mother, and one is his, Mary Magdalene. So we don't have any historical documentation for him from that period of time. So what are other sources of information? So there's Jewish author Flavius Josephus, who is not contemporaneous with Jesus either. If he's born in the year 40, that would be about 10 years after Jesus is dead. He's certainly not writing when he's first born. Now, does he mention Jesus? And the answer is yes, but no. Josephus wrote two major works. One is the Jewish Wars, which is about the revolt against Rome from 66 to 73, 74, the Great Revolt, which ended with the fall of Masada. And he wrote a book called Antiquities, which is his ancient history book. And would that we had a Josephus in every century. We'd have a totally different historical vision of Judaism. But he talks about everything that comes earlier. And in that narrative, in the middle of talking about Pontius Pilate, because he's going through the backstory of what leads up to the Great Revolt. And he, by the way, interestingly, Ellie, is one of the few people mentioned in the gospel that we definitely know exists. Because we found in Caesarea an inscription, Pontius Pilatus, the prefect of Judea. We found an inscription with his name on it. He's the Roman governor of Judea, the Roman province. But in the middle of talking about Pontius Pilatus, suddenly he breaks off and goes, I'm going to read you, if you don't mind, hear this from Josephus and Antiquities. He says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, that's Pontius Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, meaning the Jews, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct at this day. And now back to Pontius Pilate. That is weird. And by the way, I know some of
That's pretty
the greatest
wild.
experts. Yeah. And it's really weird because think about it. This is a whole chapter. If Jesus was who he said he was, that he was the Messiah, the Redeemer of mankind, the Son of God, the dead, when he died, the dead walked the earth and everything. I would imagine this would be pretty big headlines in the ancient world. By the way, the Romans, like Cassius Dio, Roman historians who are contemporaneous, not necessarily with Jesus, but around that time or slightly after, definitely mention him, but not as being witnessed. There's no Roman soldier that says, I was there when we crucified him. They do mention him. They talk about the Christian faith being based on this man, Jesus, but it's like me talking about the founding fathers of America, George Washington,
Right.
John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson,
Right.
but I'm not there to see them. But everyone agrees that I know of who's an expert on Josephus that this is really weird. That's called a textual insertion, meaning the lack of mention of Jesus, who would have been one of the most transformative figures in all of human history, in the work of a historian who misses nothing, Josephus Flavius, is extremely problematic.
So meaning
So
he doesn't mention him during the earlier times when he would have been alive and he would have been writing about it. He just has this one paragraph and then doesn't mention him ever again. Is that what you mean?
he didn't mention him at all. He does. We don't have the original Josephus writings. He wrote them for the Romans, basically. He was writing in Rome all this stuff. We don't preserve it. We thought he was a traitor. We destroyed his works. We only have, English versions of Latin versions of Greek versions of the original version that he wrote in Aramaic or Hebrew. We don't even know because it doesn't exist. Josephus doesn't mention him, period. And this is what's called a textual insertion. It's inserted by a later writer, possibly Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea, going much later, hundreds of years later, precisely because lack of mention of Jesus, the most important historical figure at that period of time and argued in all of human history, in the work of a historian who's living right after the events,
Right.
would be extremely problematic to explain how could this even be. There's no way this could be avoided because no people in the world would be more excited about the Messiah coming than the Jewish people, which means, yes, there's a mention. It's only one paragraph. I think that Jesus would be significantly more important than Pontius Pilate. Yet
Right.
he gets a whole chapter, Pontius Pilate, and Jesus gets a paragraph. So it's yes and it's a no, meaning yes, he's mentioned, but no, it's not authentic to the original text, according to everyone.
Interesting.
And just logic would dictate that's not the case.
Hmm.
So there's one more example. I don't think we're going to have time to go into right now because it takes a little bit too long. But bottom line is when we're dealing with the most important central figure in the narrative, who's central to the entire theology of Christianity, this man Jesus. So far, we see that he seems to be existing in a historical vacuum. And this is a historical period of time. And people say, what about Abraham? What about Moses? Yeah, but that's prehistoric. We don't have
Right.
contemporaneous Egyptian, Assyrian writers who are writing history books at the time. So while we'd love to have such a thing, the fact that it's missing evidence of those more ancient characters being absent is far less problematic than the lack of reference of Jesus in the major Roman historians of the time, any contemporaneous Roman accounts, or the writings of the great Jewish historian Josephus Flavius. So I think
Fascinating.
that's probably like a good place to stop for now because it's a lot to digest. But basically, to sum it up, we understand that really, in terms of we haven't really gotten to how it emerges out of, but really in every respect, both biologically, meaning that the earliest Christians are Jews who are just a virgin splinter sect. There's no breakaway religion yet. And theologically, it's all emerging as an offshoot of Judaism, kind of like a cell breaking away and splitting, and another cell coming
Right.
out of it and creating another entity that will later morph into something completely different, as we'll see the next time we talk about this.
Awesome. Okay. So as we thought, part two coming. Um, again, please, I encourage anyone to send questions, to suggest topics. If you, before we do part two, even if you have questions, please go ahead and send us a message or leave us something in the comments of the podcast. I think we'll end it there. Thanks, Rabbi Conspiro. We'll see everybody hopefully next week.
Continued.